Allora, incomincio col primo relatore che mi onoro di presentare, il relatore storico del JTF, il dottor Chris Corti. Chris Corti ha maturato quasi 40 anni di esperienza nell'industria dei metalli preziosi presso Johnson Matthey PLC e World Gold Council, prima di costituire la propria società di consulenza nel 2009. Ha un PhD in metallurgia nell'Università del Surrey nel Regno Unito e prima di dedicarsi al settore dei metalli preziosi ha lavorato nel settore energetico in Gran Bretagna e in Svizzera. Da lungo tempo è relatore di presentazioni sulle tematiche della gioielleria in occasione del simposio di Santa Fe del Jewelry Technology Forum. Titolo della sua relazione è Gioielli servono il loro scopo? Punto di domanda. In questa presentazione viene fatta un'analisi sui reclami presentati dalla clientela nel Regno Unito negli ultimi 2 anni, concentrandosi sui casi più comuni e le relative cause. Questi problemi sono in parte dovuti allo stile di vita dei clienti e in parte a una lavorazione lacunosa. Questa analisi si interroga sulle capacità di alcuni gioielli di servire il loro scopo nell'era moderna. Prego Chris. Please Chris.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here again in Vicenza. I'm going to talk about jewellery and an analysis of customer complaints. Thank you. And I'm going to start, if I can work. There we are. In the UK, if a customer has a complaint about the quality or the performance of their jewellery, the retailer that sold the jewellery can send it off, often via the association, the National Association of Jewellers, for an independent examination by a technical expert at the Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths who run the London Assay Office. This expert examines the item of jewellery and makes an assessment of the problem. Is it damaged? Are there defects, etc.? And he also makes an assessment of its probable cause. He also indicates where he thinks the blame for the problem lies. Is it with the customer? Is it with the retailer? Or is it with the manufacturer? And very often his view helps to resolve the dispute. For many years, my good colleague Mark Grimwade has been that expert, but for the last 2 years I have taken on that role. We have limited facilities in-house and we rely chiefly on a zoom microscope and the analytical facilities of the London Assay Office. Typically this will involve X-ray fluorescent analysis and coating thickness measurements. In some instances, we may go outside to access other facilities, such as hardness and metallography. But in most cases, we try to avoid this because we want to avoid destructive test methods. The customer wants their jewellery back. Over the last 3 years, we have examined 109 cases, each involving mostly one item of jewellery, but sometimes there may be more than one. For example, a pair of earrings or a pair of rings, or etc. For such assessments, it has been clear to me that in several instances, the quality of manufacture, which also embraces some aspects of design, is inadequate in some way, and therefore we can consider the item is not fit for purpose. In many other cases, the main cause of the problem has been due to harsh treatment by the customer. Jewellery design, artistic or engineered. It is probably true to say that most jewellery designers have qualified in design in art rather than engineering disciplines. They are artists, not engineers. Thus, jewellery is designed and made primarily from an artistic point of view, i.e. how it looks when worn by the consumer. Most jewellery today is designed by computer-aided design, CAD, and the programs for jewellery are based on artistic rather than engineering guidelines. Often, the manufacturer selects materials and processes that make his production easier. Rarely, in my experience, does the designer and the manufacturer consider the design from an engineering standpoint and does not consider making the piece for optimum performance when worn by the customer. The problem of jewellery being fit for purpose, that is designed and made to suit the application for which it is intended, has been discussed in several papers presented at the Santa Fe Symposium and here at the Jewellery Technology Forum, often in terms of appropriate testing methods for finished jewellery. A problem here is that there are virtually no recognised national and international standards for jewellery and jewellery testing that address this aspect, apart from what is the precious metal content. It is therefore instructive to analyse these customer complaints to see what type of product and problem occur most often and whether lessons can be learnt. And in this analysis, I look at 4 aspects: the type of product, what precious metal it is made from, the nature of the problem involved in the complaint, and where the fault lies for the problem. So let's look at the type of product. Of the 109 cases examined since January 2015, the overwhelming product subject to complaints are rings, usually gem set. As we can see in the table, and I hope you can see the numbers, this amounts to 82% of complaints. 82% are rings. 63% are actually gem set rings. And by gem set, we're talking about a range of types of ring, gemstones set in a mount, some with additional gems set on the shoulders of the ring, and of course eternity and half eternity rings, where only half the circumference of the ring is set with stones. The number of plain rings submitted for complaint is quite small in comparison, just over 13%. If we now look, it's okay, I'm just checking. If we now look just at rings and the type of precious metal involved, the table shows the type of precious metal from which the rings are fabricated. We list on the table the total amount of gold rings and also the amount of white gold rings, since white gold quite clearly is a major portion of the total gold complaints. In nearly all cases of, in nearly all of the gem set case rings, they are made by investment casting, and the plain rings generally are wedding bands made by conventional wrought processes. This analysis clearly shows the major portion of rings were gold, with white gold comprising nearly 3/4 of that total of gold. A substantial portion, about 1/4, were platinum rings, and very few were palladium or silver. If we analyse the rings in more detail, we find that just over 70% are white gold, split evenly between 18 and 9 carats. Yellow gold is the next major colour at 21%. In terms of caratage, Just over half are 18 carat, 54%, and 45% are 9 carat. Of the platinum rings, all were nominally 950 fineness, although a few were actually measured at higher than 95%, as measured by XRF. Likewise, the palladium rings were all 950 fineness, and all of the silver rings were of sterling silver standard, 925 fineness. We now look at the other items of jewellery, that is, neglecting the rings. We see on the table the analysis of the precious metals from which they were fabricated. In contrast to the rings, the major precious metal in this category was silver, of sterling silver quality, and much of it was gold plated. If we come back to the rings and the nature of the complaint, we look at a number of factors, whether they're misshapen, they've gone out of shape, whether there's cracks and fractures, whether there's missing gemstones, whether there's heavy wear, scratches and dents, whether there's a colour change, whether there's tarnish and corrosion problems, whether it's an allergy problem, whether it's a finish or surface porosity problem, or it's an electroplating issue. We find that many of these occur together. For example, a ring may have missing gemstones, heavy scratches and dents, and even be misshapen. It's deformed. And the table summarises the results. We find that misshapen rings, these are deformed while being worn by the customer, are mostly seen with platinum rings, 75%, with the rest being gold, particularly white gold. In contrast, cracks and fractures to the shank or to the mounting of the gemstones were predominantly seen with gold rings, 82%, and the rest were platinum. Missing gemstones in the mount or shoulders or on the shank were mostly seen in gold rings, about 59–60%, but platinum was also large at about 38%. There was also one occurrence of cracks in a palladium ring. Heavy wear, usually typified by scratches, gouges and dents to the shank, were frequently seen, particularly with platinum rings, 64%, with gold only about half as frequently seen at about 31%. And there were 2 instances of heavy wear for palladium rings. Colour change was primarily attributed to the yellowing of white gold, and this is due to rhodium plating wearing off, exposing the underlying off-white colour, the yellowish colour of the actual gold alloy beneath. There was one case of a rose gold plating that faded in colour, and another of the shank of a yellow gold turning white or grey. This was due to contact with mercury, and mercury, as many of you will know, forms a grey amalgam with carat golds. As might be expected, the problem of tarnishing occurred on sterling silver rings, including one that had been gold plated. This latter was attributed to pinholes in the gold plating, and the issue of a poor finish was mainly due to small porosity on the surface of the casting. There was one case of plating issues on gold where it had been rhodium plated instead of the requested platinum plating by the customer. I think somebody thought the customer wouldn't notice the difference. If we now look at other items of jewellery apart from rings, some problems again occur together. For example, tarnish and plating issues. But the nature of the complaints is quite different to those seen on rings, as we can see in the table. We note here that plating issues are the major complaint, with 14 items affected. Of these, almost all involved gold plating on sterling silver. In some instances, pinholes in the plating resulted in tarnish spreading out from the pinholes over the gold surface. Out of 8 cases of tarnish, 7 were on sterling silver items and 1 on yellow gold. The tarnish seen on the sterling silver beakers occurred quickly when the beakers were located in somebody's kitchen, but other similar beakers located elsewhere in his house did not tarnish. Surprisingly, wear, including scratches and dents, was only found on a sterling silver component for a necklace, with heavy wear of the jump ring due to it rubbing on another part of the necklace. The category of mechanical damage concerned broken or damaged clasps or catches on white gold bracelets. That was 3 items. There was 1 case of stress corrosion cracking in a pair of yellow gold earrings, and 1 case of broken metal on a 9-carat white gold locket, which was due to embrittlement. It is worth noting that cases of stress corrosion cracking used to be very common in the UK, particularly on 9-carat gold items, but we very rarely see it today. So whose fault are all these problems? Is it the customer or the manufacturer? And let's start with looking at rings. As noted earlier, complaints of heavy wear, misshapen rings, and loss of stones often occur together. In many cases of heavy wear, scratches, gouges, and dents, the main cause is due primarily to the customer. It tends to occur at the back of the shank in gem set jewellery, which is on the palm side of the hand. We should recognise that the modern lifestyle of women in particular is quite different to that of women some 30 to 50 years ago, when jewellery was only worn on special social occasions. Nowadays, jewellery tends to be worn much of the time, and the lifestyle is more active and physical. Rings get heavy wear and knocks, for example on hard surfaces or desks, or get squeezed heavily, for example such as tightly gripping a tennis racket or kitchen tools, lifting heavy luggage, and even clapping of the hands, particularly if there are rings on both hands. There are even instances where the dog has bitten the owner's hand and the force of its jaws has caused the ring to distort. Instances of all these causes have been seen in our complaints. Often this modern lifestyle also leads to the shanks distorting to an oval shape, as we can see in the figures on the slide, and this in turn can lead to gemstones becoming loose and falling out. And you will see I am not an artist, but I'm trying to illustrate that when you squeeze a ring and you get a bend in it, the prongs will open out and the gemstone will fall out. It's pretty simple stuff to understand. However, the problem may not always lie with just the customer. There may be inherent casting porosity, for example. The prongs of a setting, if they've got significant porosity, will weaken the prong and it may bend more easily and break. Examples of broken prongs attributable to casting porosity have been seen, usually resulting in the gemstones falling out, and that clearly is the fault of the manufacturer. The choice of alloy used in a ring's manufacture can also play a part. Often the manufacturer uses an alloy that is inherently soft in the annealed condition. This choice may favour his manufacturing route and make gem setting easier, but it is not optimum for the customer and the rings in ring's performance in service. In some cases, the ring has a slender shank, and so it inherently has a lower mechanical strength. With gem set rings in particular, the ring is often made by investment casting, and so the metal will be in the relatively soft condition as cast. It is not possible, of course, to work harden a cast ring to get better hardness. As shown in the earlier table, we see most complaints with platinum and white gold rings. These are usually produced by investment casting. If we look at these complaints in terms of the alloy used and its hardness, and for those not familiar, when we talk about hardness, hardness equates with mechanical strength. The higher the hardness, the higher the strength. We find that particularly for 9-carat white golds and 950 platinum alloys, many of the complaints relate to alloys that are inherently soft, often with Vickers hardness of 100 or less. It is generally accepted in our industry that alloys for jewellery should have a hardness of at least 120 Vickers, what I would call a moderate hardness. With platinum alloys, the platinum 5% cobalt alloy is considered a good casting alloy and has a moderately good hardness of about 135 Vickers. Not listed here, because in the last 3 years we didn't actually have a case, but we've seen several cases, is the platinum 5% gold alloy, which is sometimes seen in our complaints, and this is also a soft alloy with a hardness of about 90 Vickers. Where soft alloys are used, then part of the blame must be with the manufacturer, since items should be fit for purpose. It is perhaps not fully recognised by manufacturers that the lifestyle of its customers has changed, and so they need to adapt their products to meet this change. The problems of cracks and fractures was usually attributed to heavy knocks and so falls to the customer rather than to the manufacturer, although there have been examples of brittle alloys suggesting contamination by embrittling impurities, or possibly a large grain size as the cause. Another frequent problem is that of colour change of white golds. As discussed earlier, this is due to the rhodium plating wearing off, revealing the off-white yellowish colour of the underlying white gold alloy. Sometimes the rhodium wears off very quickly after purchase. This suggests that the rhodium plating is not of good quality and possibly applied very thinly, a flash coating. Rhodium plating, as I'm sure many of you know, rhodium plating baths are sensitive to contamination, and surface cleanliness is also important. Rhodium plating tends to become internally stressed as the thickness increases, and generally I think it's recognised that an optimum plating thickness of 2 to 3 microns is required. And generally I always learn that should last for normal wear for about 2 to 3 years. But I think we're seeing increasingly that possibly it doesn't last quite so long. Maybe this changing lifestyle is causing it to wear a little bit faster. In such cases, it's difficult to be certain whether the customer or the manufacturer is at fault for the rhodium plating wearing off. On the balance of probabilities, the customer must bear some blame, as often the rhodium plating on the inner surface of the shank is still intact. It's the outside that wears off. A related problem here is often that the customer does not know that his or her white gold ring has been rhodium plated. My advice for retailers is to write on the sales receipt that the ring or the jewellery item has been rhodium plated. That way there's no excuse that the customer doesn't know. But of course we're assuming that the retailer actually knows that the rings he's selling have been rhodium plated, and I think that is a question for debate. Let's just move on to other items of jewellery, and the major issue in this category was plating problems. As discussed earlier, most of these related to poor quality of gold on sterling silver, typically pinholes that allow corrosion or tarnishing of the underlying silver to progress. And this is clearly a manufacturing problem. In the case of tarnish issues, these were mostly on sterling silver, and this suggests the customer is to blame. But it also may be a retailer or manufacturer issue if sulfur-free packaging has not been used. We should all, and I'll give an example here on the slide of a major UK retailer that changed its supplier of the boxes, and they didn't use sulfur-free packaging, and every time they opened the box to show a customer a ring, it was already tarnished. So sometimes it's not the customer's fault. There is an argument that says that perhaps manufacturers should not use conventional sterling silver, but some of the newer tarnish-resistant silver alloys that are now on the market. And I think that's an interesting debate that we might have. You know, if these are available and tarnishing is an issue, then why aren't we using these new tarnish-resistant silvers? It is perhaps surprising that protective coatings are not normally used on sterling silver items, and there are several products on the market, and including thin transparent oxides, which do confer good tarnish resistance. So you'll be pleased to know we're nearly at the end of my talk. So I'm just going to summarize what I've just been talking about. I think it's apparent that the blame for customer complaints can often be placed with the customer, but sometimes it's due in part or in totally to the manufacturer, manufacturing errors, poor material choices, and not designing them with adequate properties to suit the application. We sum this up as being fitness for purpose. The jewellery designer does need to consider design from an engineering standpoint as well as from the artistic standpoint, and to recognise the harder demands placed on jewellery today due to changing lifestyles. So I'm just going to make a few conclusions. An analysis of customer complaints in the UK over the last 3 years has been carried out. We now have a better understanding of the major issues that lead to such complaints. The major item of complaints is with rings, particularly those set with gemstones. The problems appear to centre on white gold and platinum rings. Heavy wear, loss of shape, and loss of gemstones are the most frequent causes of complaints. In many cases, the blame lies mainly with the customer and their lifestyle. In some cases, the blame lies in part or totally with the manufacturer. And lastly, I would just like to say that I hope this analysis will serve to assist manufacturers to improve quality and hence performance of their jewellery when it's in service with their customers. And lastly, I would just like to give some acknowledgements to Ligor, to Massimo Poliro, Andrea Basso, Andrea Friso, Veronica, and many others who have organised the Jewellery Technology Forum, and for inviting me to come and present this work, and for their kind and generous hospitality. I'd also like to thank Dr. Robert Organ of the Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths in London for support and permission to publish this work. And I'd also like to thank my good friend Mark Grimwade for his part in analysing these complaints. Thank you very much.